Hello, everyone. This is just Mr. Chris with another episode of what it's like to be just Mr. Chris. This is for my teachers, the parents, students, or even if you're a friend. I just want to thank you once again for subscribing. I want to thank you again for spreading the word about my content that I'm putting out there. And as I wanted to also just share kind of what's going on in my life. And one of the biggest things right now is that I've had to decide whether I was going to go in the building to teach or whether I was going to continue remote. And also, some of my students have to make that same decision. And we're kind of just all following the rules and guidelines from the state and also our building administrators. So I knew the parents are struggling with this decision. I, as a parent, also had to struggle and weigh my pros and cons. And I just came up with a list of the top 3 pros and cons for in-person learning versus remote learning. So number 1, for remote learning, one of the pros. Number 1 pro for remote learning is that obviously your student's going to be safe. Listen, you know who's coming in and out of your house. You're keeping your student inside. You know what they're doing, what they're not doing. And with the coronavirus, that's the safest place for us to be. Number 2 pro for remote learning is students can get live one-on-one help from teachers using their office hours or their help session. This is something that, may not happen while they're in school. Okay. So this is something that, students really have to take advantage of, and the teachers are there for a certain amount of hours to be online. So, and not a lot of students are taking advantage of it. So this is one other pro to remote learning. And then number 3, another positive for remote learning would be that students get an advantage of learning to manage their selves and their time. Okay, this is a skill that they will need for life. This is going to be a skill that they need for next school year. So just always keep that in mind as a positive. Now, my remote learning cons. Is that obviously there's no typical social interaction or engagement. Okay, this is probably the biggest thing. They're having to sit in front of a computer screen, and it's hard to learn that way. It's hard to read nonverbal cues that way, and it's just a deficit that's hard to get over. Another con to remote learning is that students who struggle with organization and time management, they're going to be a lot worse. Okay. They, especially if they're not reaching out to the teachers, they can easily fall by the wayside. Number 3, another con for remote learning is the amount of screen time. Obviously, as parents, we try to limit the amount of TV, computers, video games that kids are engaging in. But with remote learning, obviously, you have to let your student use the computer. They have to be in front of a screen. Now, my in-person pros, if you were to choose to send your kid in the school building, whether it be hybrid or 5 days a week or however it's set up by your district, is number 1, the student obviously gets that interaction that they need from the teacher. It's hard sometimes when there are 25 kids on a Zoom screen to know when a student is struggling or needs help, because you can't have all of those students on one screen. So this is something that would put a student at a deficit. The number 2 in-person pro is that there's less distractions than at home. I've had students that are in my class, but because of a sibling being there, because of them just being at home, being able to eat whenever they want, being able to lay down, things like that, it's an issue. So if they're in the building, they kind of lose that, and they're able to stay focused on what they have to do. Number 3, positive to in-person learning is that it separates home from school so that the students can leave school at school and have home be home again. This is an issue for a lot of adults. So I think this is one of the positives for being in person versus remote. Now, the negatives, the cons to in person. Number 1, obviously there's more chance of exposure. This is the biggest one. This is, You can't get around it. You can control who's coming in your house and what your students doing, but you can't control other people's houses. And that's one of the biggest negatives to in-person learning. Number two, negative in-class behaviors that haven't been seen will obviously manifest now. I have students that typically have a certain amount of referrals by now, or a certain amount of behavior incidents by now that I have not seen yet. But once you bring them into the classroom, those behaviors will start to transpire. And number three, the last con or negative to in-person learning is that students are lacking the movement that they would typically get. So, yeah, it's cool. You're going to have your student back in the classroom. Their teacher is going to be able to engage and talk to them and see when they're struggling. But because of the coronavirus, most cases in the building, the teachers are the ones moving around versus the students. And then you have some students that will be sitting in one room for a long period of time, which isn't the best situation. So, hey, these are just a couple of my personal top three pros and cons to in-person versus remote learning. I hope they're helpful. If you have any comments or advice or feedback, please put them below in the comments, and make sure that if you haven't subscribed, you make sure you subscribe. Thank you once again.